massive underwater tunnel projects are some of the largest transportation projects imaginable. These are often nation-scale projects, not just city-scale. So when you're building one, you have to get it right. But unfortunately, some major rail projects around the world are missing the mark, and in doing so, potentially giving up on possibly massive generational opportunities. So let's talk megatunnels and their potential pitfalls. Hey there, I'm Reece and this is RMTransit, a channel about public transportation all around the world. Make sure to leave a comment down below with the transportation project you want me to talk about next. Underwater rail tunnels are a huge class of transportation projects that have changed the face of not only cities but entire countries. From the Transbay Tube to the Channel Tunnel, electric rail going under large bodies of water can be incredibly powerful, and it can essentially remove what have been historically massive barriers to travel. But these projects need to be planned and engineered carefully to maximize benefits, given that they don't actually happen all that often. For example, the channel was talked about for decades before it actually happened, as are many other long underwater fixed links. And yes, in the future, maybe I will make an exception to the fact that this channel is explicitly about transit to talk about tunnels in Norway and the Faroe Islands because they're crazy. But anyways, those long timelines mean you have time to get things right, but they also mean that if you don't get things right, you might not get another shot. One place that's thinking closely about building another big underwater mega project is the San Francisco Bay Area, as part of the Link 21 project that will link 21 Northern California counties with upgraded rail services. Now, the plan for a new Transbay Tube originally called for 4 rail tunnels, but that's been scaled back, likely related to cost concerns, I have more videos about that up here, so that it's now going to be a 2-track tunnel. So while the previous plan was to have 2 tracks dedicated to regional rail and 2 tracks dedicated to BART, the new plan means that there may potentially need to be some new compromises introduced. Now, I don't want to dive into too much of why I think a 4-track tunnel is probably unnecessary at the moment, but suffice to say, building 2 extra tracks because you can't be creative about your planning is a bad reason to build 2 extra tracks. Of course, there's a reasonable case to be made for future-proofing, especially in a growing place like the Bay Area. But the attitude that you're never going to get another chance to build a rail project is unhelpful, and it's a big factor that leads to a lot of overbuilding. The Bay Area could easily use all of those dollars that would be spent for a 4-track tunnel that might not be needed for decades on all kinds of other priority projects. And so the value of sinking in a lot more capital now is probably not going to be there for a long time into the future. As always, I think you're probably better underbuilding rather than overbuilding. And to be clear, this project is still going to at least double Transbay rail capacity, so it's not exactly a small project. At the end of the day, sinking all that money into a project that you might not need someday, cities change and national economies change, just doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially in a place where you're not exactly going to be getting those extra 2 tracks very affordably. I'd way rather the extra funds be used for things like improving accessibility, or expanding bus service, or electrifying mainline railways that could connect into a new regional rail tunnel under the bay. What's interesting here is that the original Transbay Tube was conceived very well in a number of ways. It's really hard to imagine a configuration of a Transbay rail tunnel that could be higher capacity than wide, long, 10-car subway-style trains running back and forth every few minutes. However, simply putting big trains into a new tunnel isn't going to suffice, because in this case there isn't an existing single network that could put those new tracks to use. There are a lot of BART branches in the East Bay that don't have track capacity to cross over into San Francisco, and there is Caltrain in San Francisco, which doesn't cross the bay obviously, but these networks couldn't easily be merged today. So in order to make best use of these new tubes, serious planning, the type we haven't done in North America in a long time, really needs to be done. A 2-track tunnel can handle 24 trains per hour in each direction, and a 4-track tunnel can then move 48. You need to actually have the lines ending up at either end of the tunnel to deliver those trains to actually run through the tunnel. An idea I've personally landed on as a solution with a 2-track tunnel is to use dual gauge, as well as dual electrification schemes. This way you could have standard BART or Caltrain bi-level trains using the same tunnel. And that could be BART trains from a new Geary subway or Caltrains from the south. This project is actually really important for Caltrain because the way the Transbay Transit Terminal, I'm not going to call it the Salesforce Transit Center, is configured means that if you don't have through running, capacity is going to be really limited by the tight curves on approach. Anyways, assume we have a tunnel that has dual gauge and could handle trains of either type. Well, assuming that you're going to have a Caltrain crossing the bay every 10 minutes or so, that still leaves you enough trains per hour worth of capacity to have a BART train every 3 minutes. So that's still actually a pretty good situation. Those BART trains could then run onto one of the existing East Bay BART branches whose capacity and thus service frequency is limited by the existing Transbay tube. This would of course also let you run electric regional trains through the Transbay Tube 2 to a new electrified regional line on the East Bay, if you were to construct one. You don't even need to install both track gauges or electrification schemes at once, you just need to protect for them so that they could eventually be installed. And having lines where different types of services operate with different signaling systems and track gauge and electrification schemes is complicated, but it's also a lot less complicated than building a 4-track tunnel, and it has been done in other places. In fact, the Marmaray Tunnel under the Bosphorus Strait in Istanbul actually handles a few high-speed trains here and there in between the high-capacity suburban rail services. The Caltrain HSR compatibility blog, which you should definitely go check out, I'll link it down below, proposes something that enables a similar outcome, which is running BART and regional rail through a single tunnel. However, in this case, that's by creating a new standard gauge BART line that would run along Geary using trains which would be at least compatible with regional rail, while also re-gauging the Dublin-Pleasanton line in the East Bay so that regional trains could through run onto it and perhaps even beyond. Of course, this would also allow you to order what are mostly standard BART trains, but simply with standard gauge bogies, which is something you actually see in Victoria in Australia, where some V-line trains are standard gauge and some are Victorian gauge to handle different lines. This might be valuable and simplify issues around platform height, since the Dublin-Pleasanton line is already built to the standard BART platform height, which happens to not be one of the 2 platform heights that the Cal trains are built for. The challenge here comes from extending the Dublin-Pleasanton line so it could be used by even longer distance rail services, so that trains that don't look like subway trains could also use it. But there are solutions here, like potentially having 2 platforms back to back at a few stations that are key for regional travelers. In any case, whatever option is chosen will have its compromises. Some options require a more complex tunnel under the bay and more complex infrastructure within the dense parts of San Francisco, while other options would require more construction elsewhere. What's clear is that planners shouldn't just be evaluating between 4 tracks and 2 tracks. They need to really seriously consider the potential usages of each of those tracks, the gauges, electrification schemes, and the actual platforms and lines that trains will run to beyond the tunnel, all while trying to keep everything as open as possible so that plans can change in the future, as they often tend to do. I think in this case, what's important is to keep the most expensive piece of infrastructure that the Bay Area might build in the next several decades, a new Transbay tunnel, as flexible as possible, so it can be used by BART trains or regional trains and high-speed trains in the future as well. And that means planning for it from day one. Another city I see talking seriously about a new underwater tunnel is Auckland in New Zealand, a city on a bay with little direct fixed capacity across it. I've shared my opinion on Auckland's American-style light rail in tunnels and up on guideways plan before. But while that is bad, the idea that Auckland seems to be entertaining of using an underwater rail tunnel for light rail trains is even worse. Auckland does not have a useful urban rail link to the north of the city center right now, and any new one will be a big investment. But the reality is that for the most part, tunnels are tunnels. And beyond their grade and profile, which for rail tunnels are going to be quite similar compared to road tunnels, which can be steeper because rubber tires, they're rather interchangeable from rail mode to rail mode. And so using the highest capacity mode available is smart if you want to get the maximum value out of your tunnel. And because the only real change in your tunnel you have to consider from light rail to regional rail is the profile itself, the actual length of trains doesn't really matter for the design of a tunnel, building for capacity just makes a lot of sense. In Auckland's case, this probably means using regional rail in a new tunnel, which would actually be useful for the overall regional network since there won't be slots for every train that's heading towards Britomart to actually go into the station itself. Essentially, the cost delta between a light rail tunnel option and a regional rail tunnel option should be fairly small, but the benefit delta between these two options is quite large. And of course, a mainline compatible tunnel does also open up the potential for freight services should they ever be needed in such a location in the future, as well as potential longer distance passenger services. It's got a lot more potential than a tunnel that can only really handle trams, which is probably a big part of why these type of underwater tunnels have basically never been built for that type of vehicle. What's clear for Auckland as well as the Bay Area is that for a project this big, you cannot afford to not think regionally, as well as network-wide, because that's where the impacts will be. A planning process cannot afford to be myopic in this. And aiming for an easy as building an underwater tunnel can be, and unsophisticated option risks leaving a lot on the table, without actually making the project much easier or less expensive. It's the difference between a legacy project and a lot of regret. Thanks for watching.